Hello, Rob.
Hey, buddy. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Good to
Good.
see you.
Indeed, indeed. I see you every day, but it's always nice to check in, and it should be a really interesting and probably winding and perhaps even long conversation about what we're up to and how we got here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. So, the idea behind this is our first IAM Insider Show. And the idea behind this show and this sort of episode in particular is to sort of just reflect on how IAM is evolving as an organization, what we're up to, what we're learning, um, our perception of the scene and of the world and how we're making some impact there. So that is really the purpose of this show. And so we thought that we would kick it off with kind of a two-part, a retrospective looking back at 2023 and what IAM was trying to do there, our launch and all of that, and then a look forward to the rest of 2024 and what our plans are for this year. So that's the idea.
Yep, absolutely.
And yeah, and I thought we would just start off with a kind of a look back at 2023. So, you know, why did we launch IAM in the first place? What were the conditions of the sort of integral and metatheory space that we felt like this was something that was needed and this was the right time? What were the conditions in the larger society that made us feel like this was the right time to launch this kind of an organization? So I thought that's where we'd start.
Yeah, and we could just take that each piece at a time because each one of those is actually an interesting part of I think, the conversation. So let's go back to the founding. Really, let's go back to why it got started. I sent an email to the organization, to the Integral Life community, I guess about a little over a year ago, where I talked about what I saw as the three stages of the integral movement. And I've thought about this a long time in holonic terms, right? You get a stage one identity or fusion, you get a stage two differentiation, then you get a stage three integration. And we know from kind of the physics of the universe how these three stages tend to work, or at least some of their underlying structural dynamics, what they look like, and some of the sort of characteristic patterns you might expect. So it was not at all surprising when you look at the first stage of the integral philosophy movement, which I guess, to be clear about definitions here, I would say arguably starts in the late 90s when Ken Wilber, the primary progenitor of integral philosophy of our generation, he puts together the Integral Institute as an institutional effort to try to bring integral philosophy out into the world in a more methodical way, a more systematic way, which really grew off the back, I suppose, of a lot of people being inspired by the work that he did with Sex Ecology Spirituality, which was released in the mid 90s, 95. And so you take the Integral Institute from 1999, roughly, to the time that it kind of comes to, in some ways, its own termination, but actually marked by the global financial crisis that occurs between 2008 and arguably 2010, and of course the several years of aftermath after that. And you get effectively a long decade, right? You get
Mm-hmm.
this long decade, which very clearly shows hallmarks of any stage one holonic process. Extraordinary amounts of fusion energy, right? Identity based energy of everybody in the movement, everybody feeling a high degree of cohesion and loyalty and allegiance to this organization, the work it's doing, to Ken himself as one of the founding kind of intellectuals. Lot of, as you and I have discussed recently, a lot of energy and people showing up on the back of what were some of the promises of the funding. And so I think people said, oh, there's now money involved as well. And that obviously changes the dynamics, but it becomes an attractor of its own kind. And so classic stage one stuff, also classic stage one pathologies. When you over identify with something, when you over fuse with it, it's very hard to maintain objectivity. It's very hard to maintain clear and really clean governance processes and structures. And so it went through its own version of that by the mid part of that decade, and struggled because of it. Lost management teams, it lost donors. It just had the it had the things that we often see in those kinds of social movements. And but it was the real point, and we spent hours talking about just that decade, which we won't. It's really
It's
just
a
a
long
footnote.
history. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's a long history. It's actually quite fascinating. Um, but it was very clear to me when I joined in kind of the second half of that decade that it was like, okay, this is very clearly a stage one thing. It's got founder syndrome. It's heavily identified with with one organization, and with for all the beauty that that has, but also for all the problems that it represents. And if the space is going to mature, it really needs to differentiate. It really needs to have people that mature beyond that association, that mature beyond that really tightly held identity, and move into their own work in the world using integral philosophy and applying it. And so largely that's what
And
we see,
extending it
and
and
extending it
extending
for
it
sure.
into new
Yeah,
directions. Yeah. Yep.
that's right. Yeah, you need that. You often don't see the creative burst in quite the same way in stage one that you do in stage two, because by definition you don't get
Yep.
to differentiation until stage two. So indeed, that's what we saw after the global financial crisis, that second decade. So call it the 2010 to 2020 period. You see this differentiation. You see a lot of new institutions pop up. You see a lot of different efforts pop up. I know this because about every year, integral life would be approached by someone who basically said, "Hey, we want to." They would not say this, but they would be saying it. We want to compete directly with you. We want to compete directly with you, and we want you to help us put us
Want
in
your
business
support.
to compete with you. And of course, this created a bit of a conundrum because on the one hand, we try to always orient from really pretty abundant generosity, right? We want the space to differentiate. We want organizations to go out in the world and succeed. We want to be we don't want to be in a kind of a scarcity mindset. On the other hand, we also don't want to kill ourselves. We want to be sustainable too, and we want to have our own place in the world, and to defend that in appropriate and legitimate ways. So, but for the most part, I would say we did actually help a lot of organizations come into business or into being that were doing things that we were doing directly. And we kind of figured, let's let 1,000 flowers bloom and see what happens. Um, but it was very much, I mean, we were definitely on the front lines of watching this differentiation occur. And like I said, for the most part, in a qualified way, being pretty supportive of it, because we thought it was a healthy thing to have it undergo. Uh, but it was also really pretty clear, at least to me, by the time you get to the end of that decade and you get into COVID and kind of the whole world slows down a little bit, that this differentiation had to some degree, at least in my view, had run its course, in the sense that what we needed, the problem at that point, was not the problem of 2007. So if the problem of 2007 was over identification and a lack of differentiation, a lack of diversity, the problem of 2019 now was so much fragmentation that there was no task cohesion in the movement itself. And
Yep.
the movement, again, from my point of view, seemed like, okay, it doesn't look like it has uh, any kind of coherent, codified or more centralized leadership that's going on. And you could argue, I suppose there are some positives to that in terms of the differentiation and the fragmentation, but it also has its cost, right? As I've
Yep.
said before, and you and I have talked about a lot, there's a lot of social cohesion in the space, in the sense that there's a lot of shared identity, there's a lot of shared spiritual language, there's a lot of shared meaning, right, in a space like this. But the task cohesion is terrible. Excuse me. The task cohesion is terrible. There's not a sense that um, people are working on the same kinds of things and pulling in the same directions. And of course, with something that is a theory of anything, if you will, cosmic, it's like, of course, task cohesion is gonna be tough because you can apply it to a lot of different things. And indeed, back in the day, we had applied it to over 70 different fields through the Journal of
Yep.
Integral Theory and Practice. And so it's hard to know how you orient in terms of a task cohesion from that standpoint.
Yeah, and my sense was that, at at that standpoint from around the 2020 timeframe, that the integral movement, and for good reason, was sort of largely focused on the upper right and upper left quadrants. It was about personal development and it was about personal practices, and there was certainly application happening, but the application was largely happening through individuals in their own lines of work, in their own efforts. And to sort of actually add to that, there was also just a lot of intellectual work that was being done. It was very theoretical. A lot of the pieces that were being created were these artifacts of, intellectual artifacts that were applying it, but not necessarily leading to any kind of social action or coordinated action or larger projects that might start to not just intellectually analyze certain current events from these kind of frameworks, but to actually begin to intervene in those systems and processes. So I feel like it was kind of calling out for a move to the lower right and the lower left. How do we build some culture around this and build, capitalize on that social cohesion, and then really start to actually do some work in the world through applied projects, and that was what ultimately kind of drew me to connect with you and to start to think about you know what an institution that could start to apply this in the real world in meaningful coordinated action ways might look like.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think that we have been a wonderful place for spiritual practice and spiritual entertainment. I mean that in the best way possible. Spiritual learning, and I mean spiritual in the broad sense, right? Developmental, human developmental, um, really focused on the individual. And you're right that there's the lower quadrants, the collective stuff was not didn't have a lot of institutional organization behind it. And like I said, it's quite natural that that was the case, given that the stage two
Right.
differentiation was, in a sense, by the very nature of what the social autopoietic processes were of the movement, they were gearing for diversity. They were gearing for a movement away from that stage one identity. Like, okay, I'm ready to be out and kind of not associated with a mothership. And it makes a lot of sense. And it's a totally legitimate thing. And yet we also can look at it and go, yeah, but you don't want to get so differentiated that now the movement itself has lost coherence. Like it's losing its ability to focus its attention and time and treasure and energy and leadership in ways that are bringing the synergy of those resources together in applied ways. And I think the other thing that happened is we entered a period of populism in the West that I've obviously talked about and written about a lot with the Great Release and what have you. But we enter a period of populism in the West from 2015 onwards that becomes very obvious to all of the Western democracies that what we're doing is now we say face sort of existential risks in our governance and our socio-political and cultural processes, where, given that backdrop, it's very hard for integral people, I think, to then not say, well, we better take this seriously in terms of whatever contribution we can make.
Mm-hmm.
We better get our
Mm-hmm.
act together. So by 2019, I was already beginning to think about what would it look like to try to bring together and institutionalize something that was a little bit more coherent. And at that time, I spent a couple of years thinking about some lessons from what I noticed with the blockchain. And the blockchain is really fascinating because how much of this story do I want to tell? I'll try to give a very short version of it, which is all the way going back 20 years. I was involved in the co-founding of the conscious capitalism movement. I had seen a lot of, a friend of mine was on the forefront of creating B corporations. Of course, we had known about holacracy and seen that up close and personal. So we had watched as a whole bunch of interesting kind of attempts at emergent green and teal social organizational technologies and social organizational
Yeah,
processes and
decentralized kind of, yeah,
right. Yeah.
technologies. Yeah,
All and the story there seems to be like, okay, the world system in its various ways is trying to find the next kind of breakthrough formats for social coordination that don't just need to be kind of centered inside of a given institution, but are have more of a network structure associated with them, but still allow for the right kind of command and control, the right kind of regulation, the right kind of power management, the right kind of objective and voting and what have you. And so I'd watched this for, a decade or more, actually been involved with it for a decade or more. And one of the things that I thought was pretty fascinating with all of the blockchain technologies is the way that they were beginning to solve for this amongst people that were fundamentally anonymous around the world. Like you don't even have
right.
to know each other.
Yep.
And yet they were still getting really interesting task cohesive effects. They were getting very interesting ways of generating progress on concrete action. And yes, there was economic incentives involved, and no end of nonsense in terms of the in terms of some of what was happening on the financial side. But at the core, there was also a lot of brilliant projects, a lot of really interesting stuff going on there. And so I started to ask myself, what would it look like if you tried to think about integral philosophy or integrative metatheories more broadly as a set of protocols, like a set of ways in which you kind of attempt you codify the type of sense making you do with a set of primitives. I've started to think almost in software terms, right? Which was lenses in effect. Like, so if you think about quadrants, for example, that's a primitive that the neurophilosophers use. It's a claim about reality to some degree. It's an epistemic sense-making tool. It's also an ontological commitment in some ways. If you want to take a strong version of it, you can hold a weak version of it where you don't make that ontological commitment. You hold it more as kind of just a very useful sense-making tool. So I think there's both a weak and a strong version of it. But the point is that it is a primitive that you could theoretically establish in a broader protocol where you're like, okay, guys, this is kind of something we all kind of sign up for as the way we do sense making on this protocol or in this library or what have you. And would that help to tone down some of the fragmentation of the sense making that we were all experiencing? Because it was my belief, and still is to a large degree, that the very fragmentation of green that social media and digital technologies have brought on us the last 20 or 30 years. So we were experiencing not just the fragmentation of stage 2 differentiation inside the movement itself. We were also
Right.
swimming in this massive global, differentiation of perspectives because of green and the associated technologies of them. And it was thrashing not just, our way of sense making, it's thrashing everybody's sense making. And so when I was thinking about this protocol, or I was thinking about a way to move from the green, deconstructed, flat, fragmented sense making, where everybody kind of has their own version of what's going on. The whole basis of teal philosophically is that it's reconstructive. It's basically making a claim, hey, yes, we can preserve the diversity of green, but we can re-index it using vertical and other meta-theoretical distinctions that allow us to, in effect, reconstruct a true protocol that might allow us to kind of agree on the realities we're navigating, at least in some sort of functional way. And so that was where I was by 2020, really thinking about this in a serious way, and thinking about, well, what would it look like to actually attempt to do that? And that's when it was very clear to me that I thought what needed to happen was we move into a stage 3 of the movement, an integration stage. We attempt to put together such a protocol. We attempt to put it into a set of tools that live on the very toolkits that we all use in a globally distributed movement like this, which is our screens, right? So it becomes software. And this helps us to kind of maybe recohere our task cohesion, at the same time that we're institutionalizing our efforts with a new kind of stage 3 entity of some form. But I want to say at the beginning, I want to say it here, I will say it every time we talk, as you well know, like, this is an experiment. If we all come out in 6 months or 12 months or 2 years and go, guys, sorry, we tried, the Institute doesn't work, um, this stuff just doesn't, for whatever reason, we're wrong here, here, and here. We knew from the very beginning that what we're doing is an experiment. We're going to be very transparent about what we're attempting and what our hypotheses are. But if they don't work, we knew that that's okay. We knew that it's what we're doing is may very well not, but we want to at least allow that education to help the next people who might try something. And so we decided to kind of, if you will, build in public, right? We're going to build in public,
Yep.
and we're going to attempt to do that.
Yeah, and that's in many ways what this show sort of represents, is this idea that we want to learn in public with the audience, and hopefully growing audience of folks who recognize this need for sort of this synthetic sort of third stage in the movement. And so, you've touched on a few things there that I think are worth kind of highlighting. I mean, number one, we began by talking about how the integral movement itself has progressed, over the last 25 years, and what those different stages are. But that's, of course, not happening in a vacuum. That society is progressing in some of the ways that you described, in terms of just the decentralization of information and meaning making and sense making. All of that got fragmented along with the integral movement sort of fragmentation, or at least differentiation, potentially, arguably, fragmentation. And so, really, when that differentiation starts to really drift into kind of a fragmentation, that the pieces themselves are not cohering in new and interesting ways, that there really does become this need for something that can start to cohere that, and not around, the going back to the original kind of centralized model. Here's the institution, here's the organization, everybody else, accesses, accesses through that one point. But what would it look like to have somewhat of a hybrid between those two kind of models, the sort of centralized institutional model and the kind of network model that was emerging in blockchain and starting to sort of show up in the larger society? So besides, the sort of the splintering of the media through social media and through, the internet in general, what are some of the other sort of larger societal changes that you think really precipitated the need for the kind of organization that we're trying to build here?
I think that there's a lot to say about what I've called for years the transformation age and the rise of the transformation age. And I want to be really clear that I have no designs on some sort of grandiose prediction about the entrance of a new era. Like, we'll see. Historians can decide where the exact demarcation points were. I'm there's a lot of periods over the last couple of centuries you can point to and go, wow, there was a volatile period of transition. You could look at the 60s as that, right? From the 60s to 70s. You could look at the fall of the Soviet Union and what happened in the late 80s as that. You could look at the World War II period. You could go back to World War I and the fall of empire. Like, so history is always alive. And I always like to have that as a backdrop, because the reality is that it's very easy for these big picture folks, including myself, to see the world in kind of these almost eschatological and you know um, these terms of these grand sort of structures and what have you. And there's something to that. Like that's a legit thing. But it's also true that history is always really alive. And so the fact that we're living through a period like that is maybe not as exceptional as we like to believe. It's just, if you know your history, you know that we're just part of it. So that said, there is a lot of structural shifts going on. We are seeing, if my belief is right, we're seeing the at least a potential break in the hegemony of the geopolitical hegemony of the U.S. for the first time in 80 years, really, on the back of a whole bunch of stuff. The loss of our moral stature after the war in Iraq, um, the way in which we have allowed a whole bunch of our own domestic decisions, policy-wise, to radically fracture the internal coherence of the country
And
after the
social
very
coherence, really. Yeah.
social,
Yeah.
the fairness
Social and
doctrine of
political. Yeah.
1986, the Nixon shock after 1970. I did a long thread on this on Twitter that went through about 20 different events that said here's what we did year by year, and here's why it fundamentally set us up for where we are today. It was a 50-year process of breaking down the internal cohesion of the US. Now, why do I focus on the US? It's because it was the super holonic holder of power in the world system post 1945. And so if you want to understand the kind of the global governance super holon, you have to be looking at what the primary super holon, other super holon within that is doing and how it's wielding its power, both for good or for not. And so you have to understand the US. And so we could go into all of that. But the point is that by 2020, it's just really clear that we have broken the social contract, both geopolitically worldwide as well as internally. And, I'm not going to say that's unrecoverable, but it creates this backdrop of a little bit of chaos that's occurring in terms of what does the world look like. You also have, of course, the geopolitical contestants and the rise of China, allied with Russia, allied with Iran, and everything that represents. Their attempts to displace over time the role of the U.S. dollar and the U.S. Treasury as the reserve asset, the role of oil and all of this. So I mean, like all of these are interesting things that are all coming into play in the last 5 years. I've kind of written and talked extensively about. Now that's looking backwards. Looking forwards, you also have the rise of exponential technologies. Again, talked a lot about this. You've got obviously AI and probably the emergence of AGI in the next 20, 25 years. You've got quantum computing that's going to be with us within 20 years. You have the decentralized finance that's occurring in the blockchain and Web3, which people like to dismiss this as if it's a joke. It is not. It is not. It's a very real thing. And a lot of the world's developing countries, Indonesia, India, you know, certain parts of South America, folks are getting onto those technologies as a way of handling their own finances. It is certainly going to have a very important role in the flow of stored human energy via money over the next 20, 30 years. So, I mean, all of these exponential technologies, we haven't gotten into, what's going to happen with the energy, with clean energy, probably fusion. I've talked about functional immortality that's going to be here probably this century. So you have all of these things that over the next 30, 40, 50 years are going to mark a very different era in terms of what human life looks like and what is possible. And at the same time, of course, we're dealing with a bunch of magnitude global crisis in the form of global governance on the one hand, which the UN has lost its ability to have any kind of legitimacy because the US lost its own, right? And so it was backstopping that. We have climate change, of course. We have the various environmental crises. We have a global economy that still needs to evolve quite a bit to adapt to the realities of the overshoots and the externalities that it generates. So it's just a fascinating time to be alive because you're kind of at an end of era in some ways in terms of the U.S. hegemony. You have these rise of exponential technologies that are occurring and shaking things up. The rise of populism as the social contracts have broken all over the Western world. All of the World War II winners, basically all of the World War II allies, have experienced this because of immigration and their political processes. And so it's just and then of course you throw right in the middle of that a worldwide pandemic, and there's a reason why the world feels like it's on fire, even though when you look at it from a broad enough view, you go, yeah, I mean that's what the world does. Like it all makes sense why we feel that way, and it all makes sense that we're at these kind of fracture points. But it's going to play out. It's going to play out, and the integration is going to occur, and we're going to respond to the contradictions as we always do. The contradictions are going to become self-healing as they always are. And the question is it really painful in the short term, medium term, long term? And how long does it take for that to sort of play out? But yeah, that's the backdrop of where then we as integralists go, well, what's our role in all of that? How do we be within that? And as I said, I like to be self-deprecating about us in the sense that I'd say, yeah, we're just as confused as everybody else. Like we've got big pictures and we can tell a good story, but I mean, this stuff is complicated, and there's a lot of humility I think that everyone needs to have when you're making sense of this type of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so we've got this sort of, as I see it, in terms of where integrative meta theory and the kind of organization and network that we're trying to build really comes in is we've got, as you described, like in the lower right, we've got this huge complexification, acceleration, fragmentation, differentiation, decentralization going on that is just making problems that are sort of a level of scope and complexity and scale that we really haven't seen before. I mean, certainly there have been other times in history where there have been very, very complex sort of geopolitical battles, but to some degree, the number of moving parts was what doesn't seem to be as anywhere near as many as there are now, and as many different problems that are intersecting with each other in all these different ways. So you've got this highly sort of complexifying kind of geopolitical, economic, social system. And then on the sense making side and meaning making side, on the left hand quadrants, you've got this sort of just splintering of worldviews, perspectives, values, belief systems going on at the same time. And so much so that even as you say, like the integral movement, to some degree, you could say, had a fairly shared, cohesive sort of worldview in the early 2000s. And by 2020, that even inside the integral community, where theoretically there are some of these sense and meaning making frameworks that could start to create a cohesive picture out of what's going on, even then you see a lot of splintering. And that was something that I certainly, as I sort of tuned back into the integral world in the late 2010s, was surprised to see was how even in a space where theoretically we have some of the cognitive sense making tools to be able to see how these things hold together, that there was a lot of fragmentation there as well. And so in some ways I think this brings us back to what you mentioned in regards to this sort of software system or an epistemological sense-making tool. Is it became clear to you, at least, and as you were sharing some of your thoughts around this with me early on, it became clear to me that you were onto this idea that we have to have a way of, like, podcasts alone wasn't going to be enough to make sense of where we are and what kind of solutions we might need to put forward. That podcasts are certainly sharing and exchange of perspectives, but until you find a way of pinning those perspectives down, seeing how they relate to each other, unpacking them in different layers, looking at them from different angles, and getting systematic about how you're doing that, you can end up causing just as much sort of epistemic confusion as anyone else out there in the culture war is doing by throwing their perspectives out into space. So there's this need for a way of kind of um, as we try to create some solutions for that complexification and the transformation and the change that's happening in the lower right, that there needs to be some way for these communities that are applying these high level, synthetic cognitive technologies to make sense of it, to do so together in order to coordinate their work. And so that's where, essentially the idea behind what is now context began. Although I think we're getting a little bit of ahead of ourselves in our sort of story of the formation of IAM here. But I want to just put a pin on the idea that
Yeah.
that was part of what formed the idea, the core value proposition that something like IAM could deliver to the
And
community.
one of the things I want to double underline something you said, which is so true. Like, we've all been in the event. In fact, we've all been in probably half a dozen or more events where the event is attempting to create some platform for social action. And
Right.
everybody feels good because everybody's had this state shift, and you're in community, and there's this sort of shared space of intention and vocabulary and sense making. And everybody thinks the subtext is, well, that has to be able to translate into action. And the reality is, it almost never does. It almost never does, because the commitments that are made in the room, they never survive Monday when you get back and you're in your real world, and now you're not face to face, and that's all kind of dissipated. And I have been to, I don't know, 50 events where they set it up. They're specifically set up with that kind of appetite, and they never make any real headway or traction
Yep.
in getting their agendas to move forward. And so that was also quite informing, because what I realized is that you're never going to do it on um, you and I have had the experience where we've brought people together. In fact, we ran an experiment on this early in the Institute. We brought people together, and it was on a single topic. They were all domain experts in the topic. And even with that kind of bracketing and bounding in that one topic, you see about 25 different kind of vectors of action and a massive fragmentation in just that one little group. Now, why does that happen? Well, if you understand epistemologically what integral metatheory would predict, you understand exactly why it would happen. Because in any given even domain with subject matter experts looking at it, you have different states that might be involved or being interpreted. You have different structures or quadrants that people might come at it with. You have different lines of development that people might want to do within the system. If you're talking about homelessness, somebody might want to focus on the economics line. Somebody else might want to focus on the upper left meaning making line of identity for the homeless person. Somebody might want to focus on the upper left identity of the policymaker. Like, so just that one thing, you can see how you could have 50 different vectors of action, and there's no language to get above that to actually map even that fragmentation of people who are in the same domain, same expertise, and agree what the problem is. And so
Yep.
that
Yep.
actually is a good microcosm of what we're dealing with writ large. Is if we have a way of getting at this and applying this kind of teal cognition at all, it is going to have to take that seriously. It's going to have to figure out, how does it provide kind of a lingua franca for a group for social action to occur, where it can manage these different perspectives and different vectors of action. And so, yes, that was really also some of the intention and desire behind, well, this becomes a bit of a software problem. It becomes a protocol problem. It becomes an engineering problem on the philosophy. It becomes an engineering problem on the epistemic lenses that we tend to use to sense make. from these structures. And so, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that experience. We've all had it, right? And it's frustrating.
Yep. Yeah, it is really frustrating, and it is humbling to see it happen again, even in the communities where these kinds of big picture frameworks are already present. Like that it can happen to any and all of us. That we are in some ways, um, caught in the waves, these larger cultural and social waves that are happening of kind of fragmentation, splintering, decentralization, and that we need some new ways to cohere. And that's really where, you know, in theory, and what we're going to find out is in practice, is does teal frameworks, do these big picture sense making and meaning making frameworks have the ability to sort of recohere some of that decentralization in ways that don't, again, just, we're not trying to create institutions that then move us back towards kind of an orange center of gravity and stability. Like, those days are gone. But is there a way that we can create some new structures that allow some new coherence, some new sense making, um, and some new shared meaning making that allow us to navigate this transitionary period with a little bit more grace and a little bit more vision, and a little bit more optimism and shared purpose.
And hopefully by doing so can release the synergy of different people in the room, different networks that people show up with, different capabilities, different degrees of ability to contribute financially to something, different skill sets. I mean, all these things are really important to unleash the synergy around a given kind of social action or something you want to attack in the world. But if there's no, as I say on our on the website for the institute, on the Git book where we describe a little bit what we're doing, I'll just read it. Like, the social cohesion hides a deep and problematic communal fragmentation. There's no good mechanism for functional consensus of social action in specific contexts. And that's it, isn't it? It's the functional consensus. It's where you have 6 or 8 people that come together and are able to go, okay, cool. We can see that we're holding this in slightly different ways, but we can see the big picture together. Now, how do we develop some functional consensus around that? And now let's go after it in a specific way. And that
Yeah.
was really the point: is what does real world social action look like if you're applying meta theory? Because let's remember that one of the tricky parts, and this is a really cool conversation that you and I have been involved with others, scholars at the Institute for a while now. What does actually social action mean when you're talking about meta theory? Because remember, for the anybody who's watching this, I mean, remember what meta theory is doing relative to theory. Theory is taking data from the world, from reality. Theory is a story about why that data is doing what it's doing, right? Drop a ball, you get force of gravity as your theory. You've got the data of the ball dropping, etc. Meta theory doesn't operate on real world data in the same way that theory does. What meta theory takes as its data is theory itself. So ontologically, it is a level abstracted from theory, and it is a level more complex than theory. Both, it's trying to simplexify actually, because
Right.
it is more complex, but it's trying to simplify it by noticing what's common amongst theories, so that you can then have these more orienting, as Ken would say, orienting generalizations. Now that's meta theory inside of a discipline like sociology. There are meta theories of sociology, there's meta theories of economics, etc. What integrative meta theories do is they step even beyond the disciplines, and they attempt to do a transdisciplinary, so all the disciplines, integrative, taking the theory as data, synthesis that allows for seeing what those simplexifying generalizations look like. And it's an extraordinary project. And the three that we reference, going back to the Integral Institute Symposium from 2012, which is Morin's Complex Thought, Bhaskar's Critical Realism or Meta Reality, and Ken's Integral Philosophy. Like, it's an extraordinary story of three on the margin but brilliant polymath level intellectuals, all coming out of the early 70s, all doing work in their own domain and culture, all having, you might say, starting from their own kind of epistemic bias in some way. Ken, arguably from the spiritual traditions, Roy from the heavy academic philosophy tradition, particularly the philosophy of science, Moran from sociology and the continental philosophical tradition. And so you, over 50 years, though, there is this convergence where they are coming to largely these same kinds of big picture views.
Compatible big pictures, at least,
Compatible,
yes.
extraordinary. I mean, it's just an extraordinary story just in its own, right? You could do a whole documentary just on that piece, and you know, that would be the kind of thing the institute might even do at some point. Like, that'd be a really cool project. But the point is that once they've done that, you can then look and go, oh, well, what are these really cool big picture distinctions that have been made? And now back to the question of social action, like, now, so bracket what I just said, hold that for a second, and now think about just social action in the world. Is social action for the Institute of Applied Metatheory, is it digging a well for a village in Africa, right? That's a really valuable thing to do. It's an extremely valuable thing to do. It has a concrete, measurable, immediate impact on lives that is worth doing, and people are doing it. And it's one kind of social action, right? Next level up, you might say, or more kind of abstracted, as you go from the physiospheric kind of social action into the sociospheric. So maybe your next kind of social action is coordinating communities to have a certain kind of different impact. Maybe you're trying to coordinate inner city communities for solving the food desert problem that exists in a lot of the American inner city issues, and making an impact on the chronic disease issue in the inner city through alleviation of food deserts. It's a different kind of social action. And maybe it's very theoretically based, right? It's like, here we have this theory of action. The theory is both from economics and sociology and these other things, but it's very direct. The next level up, when you start to think about, okay, now integrative metatheory, what does social action look like there? It's not digging the well, because that is, that's almost pre-theoretical in a sense. It's not quite operating in the inner city per se, because that's sort of theoretical. This is supposed to be metatheoretical or integratively metatheoretical. Does that mean that what we're doing is education? Does that mean what we're doing is policy? Trying to affect policy at either a global or a national level? Is it, is it some sort of consciousness transformation? I mean, so these kinds of questions become really, really rich, because it does force you to hold your own metatheorizing back at yourself and look in the mirror and go, well, what does the world really need that's not already being done? And what's our unique contribution to it? Like, this question of the institutional ikigai is something we've really spent a fair amount of time having question us. Like, it's not us questioning it, it's questioning us all the time, and we don't have answers, but we are living the question, and it's a pretty fascinating process. And so, I think this goes to this question of the social action. And I know you've been on the front lines of those very deliberations, because there is then that it's like, where do we, when we think about task cohesion, what does task cohesion even mean, in a sense?
Yep. Yeah, you're sort of highlighting the very, as you've talked about a little bit earlier, the sort of experimental nature of what we're trying to do. And, it strikes me as it's going to be absolutely necessary for this to be an experimental process, because part of what we're trying to do is add a potentially new layer of value and support onto the kinds of, solution building social action systems that are already in place. And so that kind of experimental nature has been with us from the beginning. In fact, we can maybe start to tap into or talk a little bit about, how the Institute formed and what were the, initial parts of that experimentation that we wanted to do. But to kind of bring us back to the timeline of the formation of IAM. So you were doing this thinking around what this sort of kind of network-like organization might look like. You've started to think about a sense-making protocol as encapsulated in some software, and thinking about where the movement itself was sort of what it needed and where it was going, as well as where society and the culture were going. So all these things are starting to coalesce. And I had left my role with another organization doing some work around integral politics, and reached out to you, and we started to talk about sort of, our visions for what might be next for this movement. And I'm sure you were having these conversations in multiple directions, but I was really struck by how how well aligned our visions were for what was needed next in this movement, and where these big picture integrative metatheoretical frameworks could really do some work to helping solve some of the larger issues that we're seeing culturally and sociologically. So we have an initial conversation, and realize there's sort of a shared vision there. And this is kind of late 2022. And we start to pull together a few folks who might help us think through what this could look like, and ultimately decide in fairly early 2023 to launch the Institute of Applied Metatheory. And I will note here, you mentioned a little bit about the three sort of primary integrative metatheories, but we didn't launch it as the Institute of Applied Integral Studies or Integral Leadership Academy. We decided to launch it as the Institute of Applied Metatheory. Perhaps you could say a little bit more, Rob, about why you felt like that framework and that sort of larger scope of metatheory was important to start an organization around, as opposed to just the integral
The
movement
sense was
itself.
that the sense was that not anyone has all the answers, and so we want to be syncretistic and opportunistic in learning as truly good integralists, right? In truly integrating what there is, the best of the intellectual toolkits that are operating at this level, and what they can offer. There is a lot of compatibility, a lot of similarities, but there are also some significant differences that I think that friction is going to be quite helpful. Actually, it's going to be very helpful for that friction to inform each other and to allow those tensions to kind of play out. And I want to be on the front line of that. I want to kind of have a seat at that in as that occurs. But yeah, it was not really. I mean, paradoxically, even though we've talked a lot about the integral philosophy movement, in the integral life community, which is the only community I can really speak to from my own point of view as a member of integral life, I still thought, but this is what we're really talking about is teal. We're talking about emergent teal. We're talking about emergent vision logic. We're talking about emergent second tier in terms of what's happening in the world. And I thought to do that properly, you have to be able to tap all of the really best intellectual resources that are coming out of that structure. And I'm not the only one. A lot of our friends and colleagues are doing that same thing with Complex Integral Realism and the books that Nick Hedlund's writing, and the book Paul Marshall's doing, and the work Sean Hargens has done. I mean, all of our friends are also engaged in this exploration because it's super rich and very valuable. And so, yeah, it was not a difficult thought to say, look, if we're going to do a social action think tank that is meant to be some parts institution and some parts network, like that polarity is there, that's aimed at applying meta theory, then obviously we're going to need to tap whatever intellectual resources are coming out of that teal structure that we can. And so that's, as you say, that's when we really start to formalize that in late 22 and then put the call out, understanding that it was an experiment, and also articulating pretty clearly what these hypotheses were upon which we were kind of putting this thing together. And I think that those applied hypotheses, which I'm sure we'll study here in a moment or talk about in a moment, but they were really important to frame kind of our own sense making about like what are we doing and why, and can it work.
Yeah. Well, why don't we dive into that? I think this is a good time to look at those four hypotheses. And I think, I'd love us to sort of reflect on what we've learned about each of them thus far, and we can kind of talk about the launch of IAM in relation to that, because they're really one and the same story in some sense. The things we tried to do in 2023 were in many ways to begin to test and validate those four hypotheses. So those four are: does metatheory make the impact we believe it does? And I'll just read these out just because I think it'll be helpful to kind of frame them before we dive into what our sort of assessments of them are. But does metatheory make the impact we believe it does? Do integrative metatheories adequately and usefully index real-world situations and suggest novel and useful insights? How do we drive value from metatheory into the real world and vice versa? So in some ways, this question
That's all
is the
one,
one
by the
that
way.
you just framed. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
just to
just
be
one.
clear, that's all just one. Under the general heading, does metatheory make the impact we believe it does?
Yeah, and that's kind of what you were getting at, which is, what does metatheory do? What value does it really add? Where are the leverage points where these big picture frameworks can actually make a difference beyond the current, tools and systems that all kinds of organizations and individuals are using in their work? So that's the first question: is does metatheory make the impact we believe it does? The second
Why don't
question
we? Why don't we? Why
is,
don't we? You want to stick on that one, or do you
yeah,
want to
do
keep
one at
going?
a time.
Yeah,
Sure.
sure.
No,
Why
that
not?
sounds great. We'll do them one at a time.
And let's just remind everybody again, these are hypotheses. These were like, okay, if we're going to do all of this, I mean, I've said a lot of big picture stuff here, right? It's grand sounding, but at the end of the day, you've got to land the plane on a real tarmac. Like you have to know kind of what you're basing your success on, or at least kind of hopefully know what some of the ways you might get tripped up are. So anytime we ever do a project, whether a nonprofit project, a for-profit project, doesn't matter. Like anything you're doing in the world, it's good to go, okay, really let's look at our hypotheses that makes this either work or not. And this is one that I think sits at the base. Like we have this operating assumption that metatheory works in this particular way. And we tell stories around that. But actually, if we're fair minded, we really should challenge that. We should say, well, actually, what if it doesn't? So, does metatheory index either theory or real world situations in a way that it generates novel and useful insights? And if so, does that how do we drive value from metatheory using those insights into the real world and vice versa? Now, I think anybody who's listening to this who's got any experience in these domains would say, yeah, it actually is super useful. It is insightful. It does create incredible amounts of value because we've all felt that. I'm very confident about that. People show up transformed by the work we do, and they continually get transformed. They grow up and show up and clean up in extraordinary ways through this stuff. So I feel very confident about that. I do think there's something different, though. And it really points to your kind of upper left, upper right distinction. But I think there is something different about, okay, now when we apply it in more complex social sort of realms, what evidence do we have that it's able to, again, simplexify it so it's not just like getting blown apart by the complexity, but
Right.
that the ways in which it's simplifying that complexity are actually useful enough that it's generating breakthrough value for the real world. Because if it doesn't do that, if it does not do that, it will not get ingested and metabolized by the broader world system. It just won't. It won't get funding. It won't get leadership. It won't get a million things that it needs to get uptake. And so at the very base of our pyramid is, does metatheory work the way we think it does, the way we hope it does? And I think that is something that we are going to have to not take for granted and figure out. And I'm not sure we'll figure it out with any kind of like, religious certainty. But I think what we can do is do things that are suggestive one way or another.
Yep. Yeah, and I actually, in some ways, I think that is that question of, does metatheory make the impact that we believe it does, and it's what goes along with it is, how do we, how and where are the leverage points that metatheory can actually, produce some new solutions and some new approaches, and all of that is ultimately, in some ways, the work that we've done in building context and trying to create this software, this epistemology software, is our test of that initial hypothesis. And that actually has kind of an interesting, um, the timing of that is interesting when we look at 2023, because when we launched in early 2023, we were, as I saw it, we were trying to do a few things. We were trying to sort of build out a network of other, applied metatheorists or scholar practitioners, whatever you want to sort of label this group of folks who were doing work, applying big pictures in their fields. And so we wanted to build out the network. We wanted to sort of create an initiative protocol. So we wanted to develop a system for pulling teams together and launching initiatives at some of these issues and start applying these big picture frameworks in significant ways. And then we wanted to build this software, to build an integrative epistemology software that could help to substantiate these different big picture frameworks and put them into a way that people could apply them together and socialize those ideas and share them and analyze the situations. So we were trying to do those three different things. And not to get too far ahead of our story here, but ultimately, there's kind of a chicken and egg question there that I think we wrestled with last year and we're still, working through, which is, do you like cohere the community first and create initiatives, and then those people are generating the sort of helping us to inform the software tools and lenses that we're using, or do you build the software first and then you use that to cohere the team? So there was this kind of question about what order do we roll this out, and in some ways we ended up ultimately pausing some of the work we were doing in building this network of integralists and other metatheorists, and the work of creating these initiatives, because we realized that to some degree we had to have this software first. So, and ultimately, I think that's because it really, there needed to be a way that we could start to apply these big picture meta-theoretical frameworks in a more systematic way, as we said, to kind of pin things down.
Yeah.
What do you have any comments on sort of how that learning came to the forefront in 2023?
Well, it makes me want to actually just go to the other three questions, I guess, and the other three
Yep. Right.
hypotheses, because in a way you've just touched on what is the reflexive and circular loop between all four hypotheses. So I suppose let's actually just go through the other three at this point, and we can touch on them. But hypothesis 2 is, do we have the leaders?
Yep.
Do we have the leaders to do what we're trying to do? Hypothesis 3 is, are we willing to coordinate action? Like, you might have the leaders, but if nobody's willing to coordinate action, well, it doesn't matter, does it? And then hypothesis 4 is, do we have the tools? So, does meta theory make the impact we believe it does? Do we have the leaders? Are we and they willing to coordinate action? And do we have the tools? Because if you get those four and they work and the hypotheses play out, well, then you get a virtuous circle of generativity. If any one of those four things break, like you don't have a tool, you cannot actually put toolkits in place that create new kinds of emergent outcomes, then it may not matter that you're willing to coordinate, you've got the leadership, and it works the way you think it does, because you don't actually have a way, again, to land the plane. Like the toolkits aren't up to snuff. If you're not willing to coordinate action, it falls apart. If you don't have the leadership, well, then the other three don't matter. And if meta theory doesn't work the way I think it does, it doesn't matter. So these are all actually organically symbiotic. And so the problem is exactly what you said. There's no easy way to solve all four at the exact same time, because
Right.
you kind of take 2 steps ahead, 1 step back on each one as you iterate, and they all inform each other. And of course, in any complex system and its stages of development, you see exactly this. There's these little micro moves that build up, and they're reflexive, and they and there's recursions and all this stuff, and you don't know if you're making progress. And then what happens is that it builds and builds, and then all of a sudden you get this emergent pop, and you move to a next level of kind of macro oriented organization and functionality. By no means are you solved yet. You've just moved to the next macro stage of your own kind of maturation. And I would say that it is fully we fully anticipated that'd be the case here. We just didn't know exactly how it would play out. So when in 2023 I think were very successful in doing a bunch of things in each one. We convened. So when we launched the Institute, and since we've launched, we've had over 350 people who have raised their hand and said they want to be involved in the Institute, who have volunteered to basically join as a scholar, as a functional leader, or whatever. So that part's been really great. And from that original group of 300 plus people, we brought in about 30 or 40 total people who were working in the Institute at some level, who were volunteering in some level. So that's the good news. The bad news is you can only be as coherently organized as sort of some of the other things you need are done. Like if you don't have the toolkit, again, that becomes a problem. If you don't have the initiatives yet that are there to work on, like that's an area that we have to do that. And so each piece that we could tell about 2023 has its really kind of good news, but it also has these parts that were understandably just limiting. So we did that. We launched some initiatives, the policing initiative, the science and ethics of metatheory, several other initiatives. We invited some of the people we knew who had some interesting stuff going on to come in and talk to us about their own things. Keep in mind, all of this is on no funding. Like we originally said at the
Volunteer
outset,
based, 100%. Yep.
totally volunteer based, no funding. Any funding that was coming in terms of keeping the lights on was basically being paid by Integral Life and by us who are involved in Integral Life. So we learned that on that whole leadership piece that we have a big gap, or at least what we think is a big gap in the ability of the folks that we were interfacing with to think in really concrete and social entrepreneurial terms. And so I'd say one of the lessons that isn't a huge surprise really, but in that, in that 6 to 9 month period, it was like a lot of the, how do you concretely apply this stuff in social entrepreneurial terms? What's your theory of action? What's your theory of change that you did a lot of work on, right? What's the theory of change? What kind of transformational thesis do you have? How, what stakeholders are you going after? Why would they adopt? What's the pain point? In any given domain, that became something that was difficult for people to sort of have the background to think through. And so this question about do we have the leaders we don't know yet, but there's very much still a big question mark about that. I'm not sure if this space has the leaders or whether we need to grow them or what. Are we willing to coordinate action? That's the other thing we saw. Like in
That's the
one
other one
sense,
that's a big open question. Yep.
yeah, I mean, there was a lot of people who show up who were willing to volunteer and coordinate action in some ways. But for those who already had kind of projects they were interested in or whatever, let's just say it, like there is a very much cowboy mentality in the space. Like there's a way
Yep.
in which people probably for good reasons that have to do with Teal and its ego structure and the way it works is, people don't want to be overly associated with any organization. And so getting that right distance between institution and network, I think is going to be a challenge, particularly for this altitude of sense making, this altitude of ego development. And I'll be very curious to see what it might take to convene it. Like, if we throw $100 million at the Institute, I have no doubt that you would be able to convene whoever you want because money talks, right? And so, fair enough. Like that, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. But I do think there is that interesting kind of question of, are people willing to coordinate action for reasons that aren't just like, paying the bills? And so, and then of course on the toolkit, we knew that we had to during that first part of 23, we're doing heavy work in AI. AI is exploding. We understand the implications, which we could talk a lot about. And it was like, okay, this is truly a game changer for everything we've spent the last hour and a half talking about, or hour talking about. It's like AI changes this. It changes the sense making. It changes what's possible inside of the social systems. It changes the way that social action is going to occur. If you start to get integral AIs, it changes everything. And so, we talk
Well, it's
about this.
worth actually, Rob, if we could pause there for a second, because I think you're highlighting what the kind of big surprise was in 2023, and it was obviously a surprise for the society and the culture at large, but it was certainly a surprise for us in this team of people trying to build this new, organization, to just have the AI bomb sort of dropped right in the middle of it. And I don't know if people probably don't know this because I can't think of when we would have shared this, but we had originally, when we had launched the institute and started work on our developing this software tool that you've described, that you've had a vision of for a while. We had designed it as an open visual canvas. So we were building a piece of software that was really sort of user manipulatable from in a very, very flexible way. Almost one way of describing what we were trying to build was sort of a Miro, where you could design all these different frameworks and move things around and analyze it from different angles, and then we would add in these templates that would be based on meta-theoretical frameworks. And we had gone quite a bit down that road developing that software when all of a sudden, OpenAI releases ChatGPT 3.5, I guess, and all of a sudden everything kind of changed. So I wonder if maybe you could walk us through, some of your own thinking about how that changes things, but also how that changed the direction we decided to take with our software piece and what ultimately became Context.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a cool story, because remember what I said about the village in Africa, and and the wells, right? So you got this physiospheric contribution, and then you've got sociospheric kind of contributions at the next abstract layer up, and then you got the noosphere. And of course, a good part of the developed world economy works in the noosphere. It's consulting, it's coaching, it's knowledge production, it's education, it's data and analytics. And AI touches all of that. AI has implications across all of the developed world, highest level of the economic stack. AI is not going to dig your oil well, for Exxon, but it sure as hell might find the next, optimize finding it. And so if you think about what AI does to the economic stack, and just in terms of the complexity of the economic stack, it radically shifts it. And it was very clear in the first 3 seconds to me, like, okay, this really not just changes, economically everything in the world, but it also really radically shifts what integrative metatheory and its contribution might do, for this exact reason. Like, if you have something which is fundamentally a knowledge product, a knowledge system like integrative metatheory, and its unique economic contribution to the world, economic in the broadest sense, like its ability to add value to humanity, um, and now all of a sudden an AI can do that. Well, the beautiful news about that is an AI can do that, and we're headed to much greener pastures in some ways. The bad news is, like, we're all out of jobs, right? And I think that's the tension that exists with AI more broadly. But it was still clear to me, like, you have to still explore that. You have to try to go after that potential, because the promise is just so great if you can have AI that starts to do these really integrative things, integrative thinking, and make philosophical distinctions that are still concrete and practical, like all of that. So very quickly I organized the maturing test on GPT-3, because it was clear to me that one of the things we have to figure out is, where is this thing processing vertically in terms of its kind of level of complexity. And so we did the maturing test, Suzanne Cook-Reuter and I, on GPT-3. She did it not knowing that it was an AI. It was kind of cool. You can find it on the Integral Life if anybody's interested in that. So GPT-3 comes out basically as orange, for lack of a better term, and then GPT-4 comes out about 4 months later. And the big question for me was, did it grow vertically? Now, as I say in that piece, and I want to stress here again, like, in some important ways, like, this is this is pseudoscience. We're taking a constructive developmental measure of complexity for humans, we're mapping it onto AI, and there's like, you really have to squint to think that it's a direct match in terms of the claims that would imply. It's
Right.
not. But if we say, does it evidence the way humans show up in terms of their sense making? What is it telling us? And the answer is, it didn't move. Like, it was orange at 3, it was orange at 4, meaning the overall conceptual complexity of the language it used was still evidencing the same basic sort of structure. It didn't move vertically. Now, why is this so important? As I said in that piece, it's absolutely critical, because if what we see with large language models as they get more and more complex, I mean, in terms of their own training, their own computational power, if what we see as they get more complex is that it's growing vertically, and we know that an LLM, any stage it gets all of it, right? It knows the
Right.
entire stage. Like, it has all of human knowledge at that level. Then we have a radically different world the moment that thing gets to where today's paradigm inventing PhD and postdoc cognition is, because that's the leading
Yep.
edge of knowledge generation. And the moment we have AIs that are doing that kind of novel knowledge generation at teal or even into turquoise, we're in a very, very different world. And I knew that this has direct implications again on integrative metatheory, which is also coming from teal. And so this was not kind of just like a fanciful or a nerd question to me. This was really, really important to figure that out as soon as possible. And again, what we saw was no vertical movement between those two. I don't know whether that's going to hold. I mean, I'm playing with Claude 3 out of Anthropic recently. I'm beginning to think, God, this thing, I'd be amazed if it's not at teal already. It feels that way. It's making the same kinds of distinctions that I and our colleagues would make at a PhD level in terms of some of this stuff. It's really freaking smart. It does it instantly. And it is, and in some ways, it's doing it better than we could do. I mean, it would take us 6 hours to make the points it's making in 15 seconds about very esoteric things. So that's of course not definitive yet, but the point is, with GPT-5 coming out, et cetera, it's like, it was really clear that this kind of changes everything for the work the Institute does. And so we have to recenter our thinking around this new set of tools. Because remember, one of the four hypotheses is, do we have the tools? Well, the world just handed us, as everybody, but in particular us too, a huge new set of capabilities and tools that we have to take really seriously in the kind of work that we do. And so that's what we did. We pivoted the software. We literally took, I mean, we spent $200,000 building that whole platform with a visual canvas and manual lenses and all this other stuff. We took delivery on it. This is a true story. We took delivery on it on one day in the summer of 23, and we literally turned it off and kind of shit canned the whole effort that same day, and pivoted the entire project to AI, and in 3 months had a new AI based tool up that was similar in some ways but very different in others, because of what we saw as a potential for AI to scaffold the speed with which you can make sense of a given environment or a given context. Because again, moving post green, moving out of the deconstruction of green knowledge formation or sense making into teal, the move is from deconstructive to reconstructive, or integrative. And part of that is just having this ability to look at a given situation, a given context, be context sensitive to it. So you're accounting for a lot of the variables and you're really paying attention to that context, but you're also bringing in a syntax, a knowledge syntax that makes sense of it in a really rich way. And that's the lenses that we're talking about. And AI was just masterful at being able to do this and to do it very, very quickly. And we knew that this is, of course, again, this is on GPT 3 or 4. What happens in 2, 4, 6, 8 years when it's able to really do some extraordinary things? So we thought that this was really the tip of the iceberg in terms of the kind of sense making scaffolding that AI is going to help the entire world do. And even if it totally makes us obsolete, which in some ways would be a good thing, it's like that's going to get digested into the world system, and we have a responsibility to help at least experiment with what that looks like, because maybe that becomes a contribution to someone somewhere in some way.
Yeah, and I think we're the intersection of. I mean, these are, as you said, knowledge creation and sort of they're knowledge creation tools. But there's big questions about how do you actually you know how do you actually synthesize that knowledge in a way that allows the useful distinctions that integrative meta theory brings to be uh, to be more easily digested by anyone to understand the relationship between these ideas. And so we've essentially created in context is this tool that uses sort of visual symbolic representations of the relationships of these different ideas. So it gives you a starting point, but we're also not at this point leaving the AI to do the work. You're not just saying, okay, give me the stage based analysis of how media has evolved over the last 50 years. It might do that and give you initial framework, but right now we're really thinking of it as an augmentation tool, that it's sort of a partnership between human teal cognition and the software, helping to quickly apply these different distinctions so that you can get a quick look at how they might be framed. And then we're going in and editing them and changing them and rearranging them and then saying, okay, well, now this feels like it needs another layer here for us to unpack. So what lens might we want to use? So it can be, at this point, it could be a tool for substantiating these big picture meta theories into a way that anyone can easily use and apply really quickly to whatever their context is. And so, in a lot of ways, I wouldn't say we completely paused the work of the Institute at the latter half of 2023, but we certainly paused a lot of the things that we were putting our time and energy into to build context. And now we've got, a version of context that is certainly not what it wants to be yet, but it's a functional prototype for the kind of sense making software that we envisioned 2 years ago, and you've been envisioning for many, many years. So in a lot of ways, and I don't think we're quite ready to start talking about what we have planned for 2024, but in a lot of ways, now that we have this kind of backbone tool, we have a place to start on that sort of cycle of chicken or egg that you talked about in terms of the four validations. One thing
Yeah.
I wanted to add about the four validations that occurred to me a while back was that in some ways, you can look at each of those validations as focusing on a different quadrant,
Mm.
and so it makes sense that it's there's not an obvious place to start when you're trying to build sort of a teal institution and a teal sort of network for applying these big picture frameworks, that you could kind of go around the merry-go-round to where to start. So do we have the tools? That's kind of an upper right question, right? Do we
Yep.
have the actual software and tools and processes that allow us that sort of build the practices in for applying these big picture theories to real world problems? Does Do we have the leaders? Is a question about the upper left, right? Do we have people with the sense and meaning making capabilities, and the leadership capabilities to actually move this work forward and work together? On the working together side, we're really talking about the lower left. Are we willing to coordinate action? And then in the lower right, we've got, does meta theory make the impact we believe it does? Do these big picture frameworks, can they actually do things that will affect the lower right systems and affect the problems that we are seeing in the world in a meaningful way? So, in some sense, obviously, intuitively, integral minds are going to generate these kinds of things. But those four questions were four questions about what would a teal sort of organization look like in the world, and where would it need to start. And so we've been kind of cycling around the four quadrants this last year and a half.
It's very true. Yep. Yeah, and something about the AI, I think that goes to, that's really important to, for, to point out is that AI generates really intelligent perspective so fast that it highlights to some degree like how valueless that becomes in a sense. It's like, oh, now that we have this, I've talked about the perspective singularity, but now that we have this like perspective singularity where you can get any really intelligent perspective on demand, basically, it kind of almost calls into question, well, what value was the knowledge to begin with? And the
Right.
answer is, well, it's kind of valuable, but it was never really where the real action was. So again, if we think, and we've talked at the Institute a lot about the framing between third person, second person, and first person processes and impact. And the third person knowledge generation, the maps, yeah, they're important, but gosh, are they far from sufficient? Because the real action then shifts to that second person process, like the social generative processes is where the action is, and none of it works if you don't have the first person leadership, the sense making, the ability to be in the kind of ambiguous environments that we're talking about. But it is fascinating how fast AI kind of obviated the what seemed like the value of the maps and like, oh, okay, well now those are just trivial. So now everything relies on these first and second person processes. And this is something I've told younger people as I've talked to them the last year. Anytime they've asked me about my view on AI and its effect on the careers of the future, I say, look, knowledge and the things, the white papers, like all of this stuff, all that third person stuff that's a part of the noosphere now is all going to go to zero in terms of its incremental value and its incremental, it's marginal, basically marginal utility. You won't get paid for it. Where you will get paid for, and the things that are still going to be really valuable, is on the second person processes. If you are a leader, if you can manage people, if you can communicate well, if you can motivate people, if you can coordinate them, that is going to be something that no set of machines or tools are ever going to be able to fully do. And those should be, as rare qualities in 20 years as they are, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And in some ways, it's like when the AI kind of bomb dropped in the middle of our IAM launch year, there was a way in which, you know, the value of what we could offer as, as a startup, institution,
Yeah.
shifted, but luckily it shifted within, you know, our a framework where there's still a place for what we could do, because if the knowledge is easier to generate, if it's easier to contextualize, it's easier to see the causal relationships between the different factors, if it's easier to if the knowledge is easier to be generated, then the value shifts to how do you apply it, how do you
Right.
coordinate social action, how do you use it to help people make different decisions, how do you build tools and programs and media that shift the way people think or the way they behave or whatever. And so, one would hope that a teal organization would have been built in such a way, but I don't take for granted the fact that it just said, okay, this part just became easier. So now
Yeah.
this really shifts the burden onto how do we empower leaders to use this knowledge to really make some traction on these big, complex, social problems that we see.
That's right. And I thought that was really cool. And frankly, one of the claims that integralists have, I think for very good reason, I think this is a legitimate claim, is that we're really good at surfing the reality that exists. Integralists are very good at being in touch with the whole, in the sense that when the whole changes, they're still seeing reality and sensing it and responding to it in a real way. And so you hand them a new context like AI dramatically changing the game, and I think integralists will be well positioned to metabolize that change and to stay in touch with, okay, that just means it shifts the contradictions to somewhere else, or it deepens them over here, or it creates new problems over here. That's something I'm pretty confident that integralists are going to be good at doing.
Yeah. And this leads to really, I think, probably the best place to launch off and start to talk about what we have planned for 2024. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we are trying to do this year, and as importantly, what are some ways that people who might be listening to this could get involved and contribute to our efforts this year. So on our timeline, we're kind of, we're at the end of 2023. We have built out context, the epistemological software, to a point where it's, kind of a minimum viable product. It's capable of applying different integrative metatheoretical lenses to any context that you might give it. We've got several kind of core lens shapes, which are based on core distinctions provided by mostly integral theory, but also we've got templates that can be used that apply a bunch of different integrative metatheories and strategic approaches and decision-making tools and all of that in context. So context is at a point where it's ready to actually do some heavy lifting. And sort of out of the blue, we are approached by a funder who has funded projects in the integral community for several years and is interested in supporting the work we're doing at IAM. So what I see this as kind of seed funding, if you will, allowed us to do is to really start to focus a little bit on capacity building. So it's certainly not enough money to hire a team of people and build out an actual institution, but it's enough for us to run some experiments and to be a little bit more deliberate about the ways in which we're going to test and try and validate those four hypotheses that we spoke about earlier, to build some capacity, to potentially even give out a little bit of funding to support some work. So as I see it, in 2024, we're trying to do several things at once. Number one, we're really trying to build out the IAM network itself. So we're trying to connect with those people in these communities who are trying to apply big picture metatheoretical frameworks in their own work. And we're trying to connect them and build a network and, actually build a database and potentially even down the line have some events for this network to kind of convene and start to come together around social action. We're trying to launch some pilot initiatives using some incubation grants. So we actually want to give out small amounts of money to a small number of potential leaders to lead some initiatives for us to pilot some of these projects in ways that can demonstrate their value in the real world. We want to develop, and we can come back to each one of these, but I'm just going to go quickly walk through them so people can sort of see what we're focused on. We want to develop an applied critical integral realism, complex integral realism sort of framework and substantiate it in context with some new lenses and toolkits. We want to support the network with resources, with toolkits and education. And then we want to communicate our progress and insights and innovations to the larger community through podcasts like this and through social media updates and through, email announcements to share what we're learning and what we're working on. And then ultimately we want to attract partners and financial supporters. So this is our, in my view, this is kind of the core of what we're going to be focused on 2024. And I thought maybe we could sort of walk through each of those in a little bit more detail with our thoughts on them and how people can get involved.
Great. So, nice
so
summary.
Thanks. So let's talk a little bit about launching pilot initiatives, because that's really the first thing that's kind of on the docket. So we want to take some of the funding that we've received and we want to actually turn it into, we're thinking at this point, $5,000 incubation grants that we are going to put out an RFP to this audience, to this community, to see who might want to support us, us by leading an initiative in one of these areas. And the current thought is that we are going to narrow down some broad issue areas that we think integrative metatheory applied integrative metatheory could have some leverage on. And we want to actually put out an RFP, folks, and we're going to let you as the community tell us where the innovation opportunities are and where the ways that you could see integrative metatheory being applied could really move the needle on some of these issue areas. So yeah, what might you add to that, Rob?
I think it might be helpful if I share a little bit about our innovation process, sort of how we've
Great.
conceived it, and I'll share my screen and walk everybody through it. Based on what I'm seeing in the screen, it looks like that fits pretty well.
Yep.
So the other thing, which we didn't get too much into, but this process was a little more elaborate in 2023 as we originally conceived it. So we did some learning. We actually ran a bunch of pilot experiments in 2023 that ran through our what we're calling our transformation innovation process. The idea is that we're innovating a transformation of some form. We're looking at a social context. We're attempting to come up with a transformation, a transformational thesis, meaning a rationale for why does this innovation, why might it do something powerful to liberate that social context in some way. And this was a more elaborated process. We were able to, we think, shrink it down and make it a little more simplified. And this is the one we're going to be running this year. So I'll just walk you through it. It's 4 stages, pretty straightforward, but I'll highlight some of the key components to it. So the first thing we're doing in the first stage is we're really ideating. So anytime we're monitoring for ideas, blind spots, hot spots, whatever, in the world, in our own lives, whatever, and we're looking for areas where we're seeing that there's some transformational fertility, meaning there is some innate kind of pain and drive for transformation in this area. And really, the test in this first domain here, or this first process, is: do we have a good idea? We're looking for good ideas. I will zoom in on the actual criteria. The first criteria we're looking for here is it fundamental? Meaning, are we seeing something that's really a deep and long lever of transformation? Second criteria we're looking for, is it fertile? Is there a readiness to transform because there's an innate pain or innate drive associated with the idea or with the domain? Third, is there a blind spot? Are there things that others are missing about that domain? And it's kind of related to 4, contribution. Can we make a unique contribution? Between 3 and 4, it doesn't make sense for us to try to tackle something where everyone else is already doing it, and we're not going to be doing something that's fundamentally unique. If we're not seeing something that others aren't already seeing, or we can't do something that's unique, there's no point. And finally, is it actionable? Can it become a clear call to action that allows for it to scale up? Because ultimately, jumping ahead a bit here, but the whole point of what we're doing is to try to develop proofs of concept, and those proofs of concept are really designed to try to get distributed to others. And so this notion that whatever idea we're looking at becomes actionable via a social call to action, that it can be something that others get attracted to, is really important. That we can imagine how a proof of concept could do that. One of the examples, I guess, to pick an example, we're thinking a lot about the what you might call as kind of the developmental challenge and developmental context of boys to men in the world right now. That we know that there is this crisis of masculinity to some degree that has been with us for several decades, that keeps showing up in the data in many different ways. And so if we refract that through, I'll just pick a few of these, is the way in which boys are developing into men and coming to understand their own masculinity, is that a deep and long lever of transformation? Yeah, it's pretty obvious to see how fundamental that is to
Yep.
society, right? So that passes that test very, very well. Is there a readiness to transform from the innate pain and the drive? Yeah, we think there is. We think there's a ton of evidence to see why it's fertile. We see there's a ton of evidence why there's innate drive here. Boys are really struggling, and it shows up in the kind of behaviors we're seeing and other data. We're seeing ways in which people are missing what we think is the psychosexual maturation and the identity formation process of boys relative to the broader sociocultural backdrop. We think they're missing it. We're not seeing a lot of genuinely kind of integratively developmental analyses that are getting at what we think is some of the core issues there. So, we believe that it's possible we could make a unique contribution there, and we believe it's fundamentally actionable. We think there's a lot of motivation around it, and whatever proof of concept gets built could be made into a call to action. So it hasn't passed. I mean, we're not yet to stage 2 through 4 yet, but from the point of view, is it a good idea? We quite like that as an area to be thinking about, and that's one of, maybe a dozen different things that we've already got. Actually, more than a dozen that we've already got kind of on the list so far. But that whole first one is about ideation. The second one that is about organization. What we really need is leadership. And so here, what we're looking for is, do we have the leader? Can we recruit a leader and develop a grant proposal or a proposal for kicking off an initiative where that leader has the domain expertise to do something in that area, is deeply called and motivated to lead the initiative in a very fundamental way, and they have to be able to execute. They have to be able to get things done. What we're doing is not just academic work. We're trying to organize real social action, and we need people who have experience doing that. This is kind of situates the social entrepreneurship stuff I talked about a little bit earlier. But the outcome of this process, hopefully, is a leader who's been identified. We've got a reasonable proposal in front of us that, by the way, it's not like they have to come in with that fully baked. We're happy to collaborate
Right.
and work with them
Yep.
on that. But we get a leader who's funded and basically we've committed to support that person or team to go to the next stage. And then stage 3 is really the development of the actual toolkit, the program, the research, the innovation, or whatever that's outlined in that proposal. And again, the goal here is to come up with a proof of concept. The guiding question is the innovation compelling? And so, to be clear, an innovation could be a book, it could be a documentary, it could be a toolkit, it could be a program of some kind. It could be a research. It could be a lot of different things, right? It could actually even be a technology or tangible product. But we want to be able to see, and again, this is not going to make a lot of sense, this little diagram here, but the idea is that these are holons within holons within holons. We want to see that when we're looking at that context, when we're looking at that map of that domain, there's a good reason to believe that toolkit we're developing will have will be a compelling and have a transformational effect of some kind. And that's really what this sort of icon represents, is the idea that we're mapping something, we're looking at it, and then we're developing the toolkit out of it. And I suppose, let me just stop there for a moment and say, if somebody said they knew nothing about the Institute of Applied Metatheory, intelligent person asked, what does it do? I'd say we're really attempting to build toolkits that allow other people that care about a domain to do new things in that domain and to liberate, to develop, liberate evolutionary potential. That's really what it is. Build toolkits that liberate evolutionary potential. That's kind of the business that we're in, that we think we're in. And that's what we're attempting to do. So that's really get developed here, a proof of concept of that. And then once there's a proof of concept, it has to go into some form of distribution. And this is where the innovations get handed off in some way. They're either scaled up internally or they're handed off to partners. And that's the key question here, is what's the right strategy to scale, right, an innovation? And you can see the different ways in which you might take different innovations or different proofs of concept and put them into the world. You could start an organization, or there might be something you need to start. It could be a new think tank. It could be some organization or movement or whatever. You might need to communicate it in a particular way. Maybe you need to get on stage at TED, or maybe you need to write a book, or what have you. Maybe you need to provoke. Maybe the right strategy is that you need to take a counter position to something that's going on, and so you're provoking. Maybe it needs to be seeded in some way. Could it be licensed? Could it be licensed to existing institutions or existing structures? Is there partnerships that could be formed? Is it something that needs to be incubated? So it's not meant to be exhaustive, but it is meant to show that once you have a proof of concept or you have an innovation, like there's a way to get it into the world that might make sense to try some different things. And that really is the fourth stage. And what I'll point out, and then I'll shut up, but what I'll point out here is that, notice we're not trying to be all things to all people. What we're trying to do is take the meta theory, apply it enough to get to a proof of concept, and then allow it to move into the world in its own way. Like, we're not going to be the everything to everyone institute. There's a lot of great people doing really important work in the world. We want to leverage those folks. We want to partner with them. We want to support them for their own success. And that's really what this model is attempted to do, is kind of be a social. It's an engineered model to take to do a social process from what we have, what we think we have, and interface with the world.
Yeah, and once we've selected these right leaders and these initiatives, start to launch, what we hope that we can provide. I mean, $5,000. We wish it was much more than that. We don't have the funding to be able to distribute, larger incubation grants. But it's a little financial support. But alongside that financial support comes, a process like this, access to other people in the network. Access to our thought partnership on this, our support, our tools and resources, so that hopefully we can help shepherd these initiatives along, so that what becomes that end, proof of concept to be tested or distributed in some way is something that's really been refined and supported by the entire resources of the Institute. So that's the hope. And when we're terribly curious to see what ends up coming out of this process, what kind of initiatives people are interested in leading, what kind of solutions come out of those initiatives, and we plan on being able to support them in each of these different stages, so that hopefully by the end there's something that can actually have some leverage on these big challenges we face.
And I guess I want to echo what you said, that the idea here is that if we can release the synergy of a network, of a whole movement network, into or on behalf of a leader or leaders in a team that are going through this process, then even though we're doing a small amount of seed funding just to kind of get to a proof of concept or germinate some ideas, if we can expose their work via the various shows and the media platforms we have, if we can get them scholarly support, if we can tap them into other network support, like, there's no reason why the synergistic effects of that network should not be able to generate something that becomes, its own kind of think tank builder, like its own kind of, like the Institute of Applied Metatheory. Another way to think about it is it almost should be generating kind of think tanks. Like, it should be a think tank baby maker in a sense, like, because each one of these areas becomes an important area of working on in a given domain, whether it be, the masculinity thing we talked about, policing. I mean, these are big areas. So a big question is whether the synergy of our overall network, and the tens of thousands of people that we speak to regularly, can come together to differentially help with any given one of these initiatives. And we hope the answer is yes.
Yep. Great. Thank you for that walkthrough, Rob. That was perfect. We'll come back to the sort of a request for proposals for that at the very end, because that'll be our sort of last piece. But before we did, I wanted to talk about some of these other things that we were trying to do this year in a little bit greater detail. So the next one I was hoping you might be able to speak to, Rob, is this idea of developing an applied complex integral realism framework in context and what that might look like.
Yeah. So, and this is where I want to be careful because this can get really geeky pretty fast, and I think we have to balance a couple of things here. On the one hand, we want to take these integrative metatheories and we want to have them dance with each other so that the work we're doing as the institute and in the network is being informed by the best kind of lenses and frameworks that might be coming out of that dance, and that the way in which they collaborate or frictions or whatever. And maybe even, to put it as an example, I would imagine and think we will have a funded set of initiatives that are specific to nothing but developing complex integral realism as an intellectual kind of framework, and the primitives that come out of it and the lenses and what have you. Like, that's a very um, core activity to what we're doing. On the other hand, we also recognize that it has to be user friendly enough where it's not so academic, or it's as academic as it needs to be, but no more. And so it doesn't become not applicable. Like, if it becomes not applicable, that becomes a problem. And so that's going to be a tension that lives in our world a lot. And it is an area that AI will be able to help with, I think. Actually, probably help with a lot, but is also going to require a lot of smart human work. And so I don't want to scare people off, but it is really interesting stuff. So, for example, if I take, I'll show you another screen here of some work that we've been on about in one of the initiatives, where what we're looking at here is taking the four quadrants, the four quadrants everybody knows: interior, exterior, lower left and lower right, culture and society. And then we're merging it, or kind of playing with examples of the way it might play with critical realism's um, uh, uh, social model of social transformation, and some of the sociology that comes out of, like, Margaret Archer's morphogenesis. She's a sociologist, critical realist, and what you'll see, that what happens is you get some interesting things where maybe social interactions occur in the middle part between the upper left, upper right, and the lower left and lower right. You get some new conceptual distinctions that come in to play. You get some processes in the form of socialization and some constraints that these structural elements in the lower quadrants apply to the upper quadrants. You have ways in which the actions of the agent, so up here, both the thinking and the actions of the agent, either reproduce the social system here in a morphostatic way, or begin a process of transformation with emergent properties of morphogenesis. So when we're talking about transforming structures or transforming society in some way, what we're really looking at is this process here. We're looking at how do new actions, maybe they largely reproduce an existing structure, but how do they also generate transformation and some new emergent properties, so that the social objects, material relations, social positions, practices, and ideas that exist in the cultural and social system become actually a new version as time processes from state one to state two. Now, I've just said a lot, and we can spend 6 hours unpacking all of the things I just said, but to the degree that we've got a very powerful new framework that is looking at what the metatheories are saying, and then we're providing a really well-trained AI that's an expert in this particular framework to help you very quickly get to what's going on in a given situation or a given context. and to suggest possible points of intervention or strategies or whatever, like that is a radically new capability, which we now have or we should have soon. And it's made possible at the intersection of us asking questions from a teal cognitive point of view about the metatheories, and then bringing in LLMs to help scaffold that, and then making those a somewhat user friendly toolkit for people. And so that's a long-winded way of saying that the work we do in formulating what could be the primitives and the frameworks of a complex integral realism, combining it with the work we've already done on AI, provides a new kind of capability for initiatives to do interesting work in the world, maybe with some strategies that people aren't already seeing. And if nothing else, like even if the innovations themselves don't scale up, just by virtue of doing the work and socializing it, that is its own kind of contribution, showing what is possible, maybe inspiring others to do similar things in taking these integrative frameworks seriously, and maybe that gets metabolized into social systems. So there's a lot of different levels upon which the kind of work we're doing could potentially add value, and maybe offer something useful to folks. But that's probably as concretely a way to look at what we're doing on the CIR side as I can think of.
Yeah, and we'll be sharing some of the progress along that work, but in a lot of ways, the work that you're describing, Rob, is kind of the on that sort of network think tank polarity that we're existing on is a little bit more towards that think tank side. Is how can we create some new frameworks that allow these big pictures to be applied more easily, more comprehensively, and in new ways than they currently are. And part of that is also ultimately about educating the integral community around these other integrative meta theories, and helping them to understand the ways in which they do, you know, they have filled in some of the blind spots or partialities even of integral meta theory itself. So we hope to be able to kind of over time begin to introduce those other two and even more integrative meta theories to the integral communities so that they can become part of the toolkit that we can all bring.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that, of the people who are involved on the metatheory side of the institute, I would say actually the majority is not in integral philosophy. Actually, we've got
Right.
we've got people in critical realism, and we've got people in complex thought. So we're not at all kind of biased one way or another. We're looking at all of them on hopefully what is equal footing, and asking questions about it.
Yeah, so we're excited to keep that work going, and we're excited to share it with everyone as we develop some new lenses and insights around complex integral realism. So the next piece that I had mentioned is to support the network with resources, tools, and education, and I think we've already spoken to that. I mean, that's one of the biggest projects that we're going to have this year is to provide tools that allow both the leaders in our initiatives, but also the network itself to begin to apply these in their own contexts. We're obviously going to communicate our progress and share insights and innovations through, like I said, through conversations like this, through podcasts, through media, through social media, white papers even. We'll be socializing a lot of this work as we go along. And then ultimately, the last goal of the year, which I'll touch upon again one more time, is to attract partners and financial supporters. So, we're going to be tapping into those networks ourselves, but we want the network itself to also sort of be a resource and information sharing network. So, if you know of folks, funders, philanthropists, potential partners in some sphere like academia, for example, that you think might be interested in this work or interested in partnering with us or interested in supporting this kind of a work, to please put us in contact with them so we can bring them into the fold. So I thought we would conclude just with a kind of brief what's next and what people can expect to hear from us soon around. And to me, that really is about the RFP. So our hope is that in the next few weeks, we will have launched an RFP for different leaders in your fields to apply for these incubation grants, and to essentially join us in helping to lead an initiative in one of the several areas that we will define in the RFP. So, Rob mentioned as one example this sort of boys to men kind of developmental crisis could be one area that we are interested in people helping to submit proposals for. And there's probably several others that we will launch along with that. Just say, look, these are the areas where we think that integrative meta theory can have the most leverage and could contribute something unique. And we will be asking for anyone who is interested to fill out a form and apply for funding to join us by leading an initiative.
Yeah, one of the things I would mention here is that you can never take too seriously anything we do as a first step, because mostly our first steps are always agile and meant to learn. And so we often run our first steps in an experimental way before we scale anything up, because we always want to do something small, iterate it and learn before we do something once, then do it twice before you do it 10 times. That's a really important principle in terms of, well, doing anything successfully in the world. And so when we come out in the next month with our first blush at a proposal or a set of seed grants or whatever, it is just that. It's that first one. We'll probably do something with it, and then we might come out with a couple of more, a few months later, and then slowly sort of scale that process up. And each step along the way, the design is to be learning about, like, what's working. Are we languaging it properly? Did we get a flood of proposals? Did we get none? Like, all of those things are unknown, and so we're going to be doing that. So I guess I say that because I wouldn't want anyone to go, oh, I submitted something, I never heard, or I didn't hear back in a month, and it must have just fallen in the ether. Actually, no. It's just as we have to be quite agile of mind and iterative and experimental, we're also looking for people that are similarly minded, and you have to kind of be willing to go on that ride with us, because those are the people that are going to help us succeed at this. Yeah, the categories that we're going to put out are by no means canonical. They're a set of categories that we're kind of initially interested in. We will also be open to other areas that we haven't put on the list, and maybe we'll see something that's like, wow, we really need to do that. And we'll probably also start conversations with people where, just like a Hollywood studio goes into development on a script long before the movie gets made, and we'll probably start conversations with people where it's like, okay, maybe we don't have an obvious something to do next week, but let's start talking about this. Let's see how something could come together for, maybe we do something in 3 months now, 6 months, 9 months, because that kind of collaboration is super important. Maybe we can actually get something going, over time. And I kind of expect that's going to happen too.
Yeah, well said, Rob. As with anything like this, it's all going to be very emergent, and so we really are looking to sort of expand and learn and stay agile as we go along. So I appreciate that caveat. So that was now going on just past the 2 hour mark, sort of encapsulation of what we've been up to in the last year and a half and where we hope to go forward. We really appreciate everyone joining us on this journey. We invite you to really become a part of this network, to get in touch with us if you've got an idea, if you've got a way that you feel like you can contribute, if you've got somebody or some institution that you think should get plugged in as a partner, to reach out to us and really help us to activate this network. And yeah, I just want to thank you, Rob, for your leadership in this process. It's been it's been very inspiring to work alongside you in this, and I'm excited to see what comes next.
Well, right back at you. It's been great to work with you, and it's every step of the way has been really enjoyable, even when it's been sometimes painful. But it's been great, and I'm looking forward to what comes next. And I appreciate everybody tuning into this. I know 2 hours can be a bit of a long thing to pay attention to. But I hope it's given you a sense of the the nuance and the interesting dynamics of working in this kind of field at this level at this point in time. And so if this kind of thing turns you on, you'd really have a home here. So I welcome you getting involved.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks, Rob. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Okay,
We'll see you next time.
talk to you later. Bye bye.